What if I told you that some of America's most beloved family suppers have almost completely disappeared? For decades, these meals came straight from Betty Crocker cookbooks, filling dinner tables across the country and becoming favorites that families requested again and again. Today, many younger Americans have never even heard their names. Some turned simple pantry staples into unforgettable comfort food, while others looked elegant enough to be served in fine restaurants, even though they were made in ordinary home kitchens. So today, we're opening the pages of vintage Betty Crocker cookbooks to rediscover 30 forgotten suppers that once defined American home cooking. And be sure to stay until the very end, because the #1 recipe may be the most surprising and impressive Betty Crocker supper you've never heard of. Let's step back into the golden age of American home cooking and uncover the 30 old Betty Crocker suppers nobody cooks anymore. 30. Beef Stroganoff Skillet. What made one creamy skillet dinner become one of the most treasured Betty Crocker suppers of the 1950s? Long before boxed meal kits and drive-through dinners became part of everyday life, this rich and comforting recipe helped busy American families enjoy a restaurant-style meal without leaving their own kitchens. Open a Betty Crocker cookbook from the mid-1950s, and you would likely find beef stroganoff skillet among its most dependable weeknight favorites. Inspired by the famous Russian classic but simplified for American home cooks, it combined tender strips of beef, sliced mushrooms, onions, and a silky sour cream sauce into one satisfying pan. Served over buttery egg noodles, it looked elegant enough for company yet simple enough for an ordinary Tuesday evening. The secret was not expensive ingredients. It was Betty Crocker's practical method. Everything cooked in a single skillet, allowing the beef to stay juicy while the mushrooms soaked up every bit of the rich, savory sauce. A spoonful of sour cream stirred in at the very end created the smooth, velvety finish that families remembered long after dinner was over. For many parents, this meal struck the perfect balance between comfort and convenience. It was hearty enough for hard-working fathers returning home after long shifts, while children loved every bite of the creamy noodles coated in flavorful sauce. Best of all, it came together without filling the sink with dirty pots and pans, something every homemaker appreciated after a busy day. Although modern restaurants still serve versions of beef stroganoff, the original Betty Crocker skillet supper carried a warmth that could never be copied. It was more than dinner. It was a reason for families to slow down, gather around the table, and share stories before the evening came to an end. And if you think this forgotten classic was clever, wait until you discover the surprisingly simple canned pantry meal that became another unforgettable Betty Crocker favorite. 29. Tuna Noodle Supreme. Who would have guessed that one simple can of tuna could become the centerpiece of one of Betty Crocker's most beloved family suppers? During the 1950s, this humble casserole proved that a few pantry staples could create a meal everyone looked forward to, even on the busiest weeknights. Open a vintage Betty Crocker cookbook, and Tuna Noodle Supreme appeared as the perfect answer for families trying to feed several hungry mouths without stretching the grocery budget. White egg noodles were gently folded together with flaky canned tuna, cream of mushroom soup, sweet green peas, and a splash of milk that created a rich, creamy filling. Everything was poured into a buttered baking dish before being topped with buttery breadcrumbs that turned beautifully crisp in the oven. As it baked, the casserole filled the entire house with an aroma that signaled dinner was almost ready. The creamy center stayed soft and comforting while the golden topping added just the right amount of crunch with every bite. It was simple home cooking at its finest, requiring little preparation but delivering plenty of flavor. For many American mothers, this recipe became a dependable weeknight hero. Canned tuna stayed in the pantry, frozen peas waited in the freezer, and the remaining ingredients were already kitchen essentials. Without spending much money or time, they could place a hot, filling supper on the table that satisfied both children and adults alike. Today, casseroles like this have quietly disappeared from many family kitchens, replaced by frozen meals and takeout. Yet Tuna Noodle Supreme reminds us of a time when ordinary ingredients, shared around a crowded dinner table, created memories that lasted far longer than the meal itself. But Betty Crocker had another forgotten supper that transformed a handful of ground beef into something so flavorful that generations of home cooks kept the recipe within easy reach. 28. Swedish meatballs in cream gravy. How did a simple family recipe with European roots become one of the most cherished Betty Crocker suppers in American homes? Long before frozen meatballs filled supermarket freezers, families proudly made this comforting classic completely from scratch, and the results were unforgettable. During the 1950s, Betty Crocker introduced home cooks to a version of Swedish meatballs that was both elegant and practical. Ground beef was blended with breadcrumbs soaked in milk, finely chopped onions, and just a hint of nutmeg, a small ingredient that gave the meatballs their distinctive, old-fashioned flavor. Each one was carefully rolled by hand, browned until beautifully golden, then gently simmered in a rich cream gravy made with beef broth and sour cream. Served over buttered egg noodles or a generous helping of creamy mashed potatoes, every spoonful delivered the kind of comfort that busy American families craved after a long day. The silky gravy soaked into every bite, while the tender meatballs remained juicy and full of flavor. It was the sort of supper that encouraged everyone to linger at the table just a little longer. This dish also became a favorite at church suppers, holiday gatherings, and neighborhood potlucks because it could feed a crowd without sacrificing quality. Many homemakers prepared the meatballs ahead of time, then finished the gravy just before serving, making it an ideal choice whenever company was expected. Although Swedish meatballs still appear in restaurants today, the original Betty Crocker version carried something modern recipes often miss: the satisfaction of careful preparation and the warmth of sharing a homemade meal with the people who mattered most. But if you think these hearty meatballs were impressive, the next forgotten Betty Crocker supper turned ordinary leftover chicken into a dish so elegant that families proudly served it on their most special occasions. 27. Chicken à la king in pastry shells. What made leftover chicken feel like it belonged on the menu of an elegant hotel dining room? For countless American families during the 1950s, Betty Crocker had the answer with a supper that transformed ordinary ingredients into a meal worthy of the weekend. Chicken à la king quickly became one of the cookbook's most admired recipes because it turned yesterday's roasted chicken into something entirely new. Tender pieces of chicken were combined with sliced mushrooms, sweet green peas, colorful bell peppers, and a rich homemade cream sauce seasoned with a touch of paprika. The mixture slowly simmered until every ingredient was coated in a smooth, velvety sauce that looked as impressive as it tasted. But the feature everyone remembered was not just the creamy filling. It was the golden pastry shell. Fresh from the oven, the light, flaky shell was carefully filled with the hot chicken mixture, creating a supper that looked elegant enough for holiday dinners yet was surprisingly simple for home cooks to prepare. Every bite combined crisp pastry with creamy chicken, giving the dish a texture that felt wonderfully special. For homemakers, this recipe was a practical way to make leftovers exciting again. Instead of serving the same roast chicken a second night, they created an entirely different meal that delighted family members and impressed unexpected guests. It became a favorite choice for bridal luncheons, church gatherings, and family celebrations where presentation mattered just as much as flavor. Today, chicken à la king is rarely found outside vintage cookbooks. Yet it represents an era when creativity in the kitchen turned everyday ingredients into memorable family meals. It was proof that a little imagination could make even leftovers feel luxurious. And if this elegant chicken supper surprised you, the next forgotten Betty Crocker favorite proved that a few pork chops and a pan of rice could create one of the most comforting one-dish dinners of the entire decade. 26. Pork chops with mushroom rice. How did a few everyday ingredients become one of Betty Crocker's most dependable family suppers? At a time when busy homemakers needed hearty meals that could practically cook themselves, this comforting one-pan dinner earned a permanent place in kitchens across America. During the late 1950s, pork chops with mushroom rice became a favorite because it delivered a complete meal in a single baking dish. Thick, bone-in pork chops were lightly seasoned and arranged over a bed of long-grain rice mixed with cream of mushroom soup, chopped onions, and savory seasonings. Once everything was tucked into the oven, the slow baking did the rest. As the pork roasted, its flavorful juices soaked into the rice below, turning simple pantry ingredients into something rich and satisfying. The rice became creamy and tender while the pork chops stayed juicy enough to cut with a fork. By the time the casserole emerged from the oven, The kitchen was filled with the comforting aroma of roasted meat and buttery mushrooms, a sure sign that dinner was ready. Families loved this recipe because it required very little attention after the dish went into the oven. While suppers slowly baked, mothers could finish household chores, help with homework, or simply enjoy a quiet moment before everyone gathered around the table. It was practical cooking without sacrificing flavor, exactly the kind of dependable recipe Betty Crocker became famous for. Although one-pan meals are popular again today, many people have forgotten this classic combination that once appeared on dinner tables throughout the country. It reminded families that delicious food did not have to be complicated. Sometimes the simplest recipes created the warmest memories, especially when shared with the people waiting around the table. But Betty Crocker had another clever way of giving leftovers a second life. The next forgotten supper transformed yesterday's roast beef into a rich, comforting casserole that many families claimed tasted even better the second time around. 25. Beef and biscuit casserole. What made yesterday's roast beef become the supper everyone hoped would appear on the table again? During the 1950s, wasting good food was simply not an option, and Betty Crocker showed American families how leftovers could be transformed into something every bit as satisfying as the original meal. Instead of serving cold slices of roast beef a second time, resourceful home cooks cut the meat into tender chunks and combined it with carrots, celery, onions, and a rich homemade brown gravy. The filling slowly simmered until every ingredient was coated in deep, savory flavor. Then came the part that made this casserole unforgettable. Soft spoonfuls of biscuit dough were dropped over the bubbling beef mixture before the entire dish went into the oven. As the casserole baked, the biscuits rose into fluffy, golden pillows while the rich gravy bubbled around their edges. The bottoms absorbed just enough sauce to stay moist and flavorful, while the tops baked into a beautifully crisp crust. Every forkful delivered tender beef, hearty vegetables, creamy gravy, and warm biscuit in one comforting bite. This recipe quickly became a favorite for busy families because it stretched leftovers without making supper feel repetitive. It was economical, filling, and satisfying enough to feed a table full of hungry children after school or hardworking parents returning home after a long day. More importantly, it reminded families that good cooking was about making the most of what was already in the kitchen. Today, leftover recipes rarely receive the attention they once did, yet beef and biscuit casserole represents an era when creativity mattered more than convenience. With a handful of simple ingredients and a little patience, ordinary leftovers became a meal that tasted fresh, comforting, and made entirely with care. But Betty Crocker was not finished reinventing everyday ingredients. The next forgotten supper introduced American families to an international-inspired dish that brought a touch of adventure to ordinary weeknight dinners without ever leaving home. 24. American-style chop suey. How did a dish inspired by Chinese cuisine become one of Betty Crocker's most unexpected weeknight favorites? During the 1950s, adventurous home cooks were eager to try new flavors, and this hearty supper brought a taste of something different to American dinner tables without requiring unusual ingredients. Betty Crocker's American-style chop suey was designed with simplicity in mind. Ground beef was browned with chopped onions until fragrant, then combined with crisp celery, green bell peppers, bean sprouts, and a savory blend of soy sauce and beef broth. Everything simmered together just long enough for the vegetables to stay slightly crisp while soaking up the rich, flavorful sauce. Served over fluffy white rice or a bed of crunchy chow mein noodles, it offered a welcome change from the usual meat and potatoes routine. The appeal of this dish was its balance of familiar and new. Families enjoyed the comforting taste of seasoned beef while discovering flavors that felt exciting and modern for the time. It became a popular choice for weeknight dinners because it cooked quickly, used affordable ingredients, and could easily feed a hungry household without straining the grocery budget. For many Americans, recipes like this marked the beginning of exploring international cooking at home. Betty Crocker introduced these flavors in a way that felt approachable, giving home cooks the confidence to try something outside their everyday menu while still creating a meal the whole family would enjoy. Although today's restaurants offer countless Asian-inspired dishes, this vintage version remains a reminder of an era when introducing soy sauce to the dinner table felt surprisingly adventurous. It reflected a changing America, where home kitchens slowly embraced new culinary influences while holding onto the warmth of traditional family suppers. But if this internationally inspired favorite brought something new to the dinner table, the next forgotten Betty Crocker supper returned to pure American comfort with a sweet and savory combination that became a Sunday tradition in countless homes across the country. 23. Ham and sweet potato bake. What made the combination of smoky ham and sweet potatoes one of Betty Crocker's most treasured Sunday suppers? At first glance, it seemed like an unusual pairing, but once families tasted the rich, caramelized flavors, this comforting casserole became a tradition that returned to the dinner table year after year. Throughout the 1950s, this hearty bake appeared in Betty Crocker cookbooks as an ideal way to turn a simple ham into a complete family meal. Thick slices of baked ham were layered with tender rounds of sweet potatoes before everything was covered with a buttery glaze made from brown sugar, a touch of orange juice, and warm spices. As the dish slowly baked, the sweet potatoes absorbed the savory juices from the ham while the glaze bubbled into a beautiful golden coating. The aroma alone was enough to gather everyone in the kitchen long before supper was served. The edges caramelized into irresistible bites filled with rich sweetness, while the center remained soft, creamy, and perfectly balanced by the smoky flavor of the ham. Every forkful offered a combination of sweet and savory that felt both comforting and special. Families especially loved serving this casserole after holidays, when leftover ham could easily become an entirely new meal. Instead of feeling like leftovers, it became something people genuinely looked forward to. The colorful layers also made it a favorite for church dinners and family gatherings, where it looked just as inviting as it tasted. Today, this once-beloved casserole has largely disappeared from everyday cooking, replaced by quicker meals and changing tastes. Yet it reminds us of a time when Sunday supper was more than just dinner. It was an opportunity for generations to gather, slow down, and enjoy a homemade meal prepared with patience and care. But Betty Crocker had another forgotten classic waiting in the wings. The next supper transformed an inexpensive pantry staple into an elegant centerpiece that surprised even those who claimed they never enjoyed seafood. 22. Salmon loaf with creamy egg sauce. How did a humble can of salmon become the centerpiece of one of Betty Crocker's most memorable family suppers? At a time when fresh seafood was not always affordable or available, this clever recipe proved that pantry staples could be transformed into something surprisingly elegant. During the 1950s, salmon loaf was a trusted favorite in countless American kitchens. Flaked canned salmon was gently mixed with fresh breadcrumbs, beaten eggs, finely chopped celery, onions, and a blend of simple seasonings before being pressed into a loaf pan and baked until the outside turned beautifully golden. The result was firm enough to slice neatly, yet tender enough to melt apart with every bite. What truly made this supper unforgettable was the creamy egg sauce served over each slice. Made with butter, milk, and finely chopped hard-boiled eggs, the silky sauce added richness without overpowering the delicate flavor of the salmon. A sprinkle of fresh parsley and a hint of dill completed the dish, giving it a bright, homemade taste that families remembered for years. This recipe became especially popular during Lent and on Fridays, when many households looked for satisfying meatless meals. It was affordable, nourishing, and simple enough for busy homemakers to prepare after a full day of work around the house. Served alongside buttered peas, mashed potatoes, or steamed vegetables, it created a complete supper that felt both wholesome and comforting. Although salmon loaf has nearly disappeared from modern dinner tables, it reflects a time when creativity mattered more than expensive ingredients. Betty Crocker showed families that careful preparation and simple pantry items could produce a meal worthy of gathering everyone around the table. But if you think this seafood classic was an ingenious way to stretch the pantry, the next forgotten Betty Crocker supper wrapped tender chicken in the ultimate comfort food, creating a casserole so satisfying that many families considered it the perfect cure for a long, exhausting day. 21. Chicken and dumpling casserole. What made one humble chicken casserole feel like a warm hug after the longest day? Long before comfort food became a popular phrase, Betty Crocker introduced a supper that filled homes with irresistible aromas and brought families together around the dinner table, no matter how busy life became. During the mid-1950s, chicken and dumpling casserole earned a place among America's favorite homemade meals. Tender pieces of cooked chicken were combined with carrots, celery, onions, and sweet peas in a rich, creamy sauce that slowly bubbled as it baked. But the true highlight was the fluffy dumplings resting on top, turning golden while gently steaming from the savory filling beneath them. The dumplings were made from a simple mixture of flour, baking powder, milk, butter, and eggs, yet they became wonderfully light and airy in the oven. Each spoonful offered a perfect balance of creamy chicken, tender vegetables, and soft dumplings that soaked up every bit of the flavorful sauce. It was the kind of meal that encouraged everyone to ask for just one more serving before leaving the table. For many homemakers, this casserole was the definition of dependable cooking. It stretched leftover roast chicken into a complete family supper without sacrificing taste or presentation. Better still, everything baked together in one dish, making cleanup almost as easy as preparation. Although recipes have changed over the decades, few modern casseroles capture the same feeling of comfort that this classic delivered. It represented an era when homemade meals were prepared with patience, shared with loved ones, and remembered long after the plates had been cleared. Every bubbling casserole carried the promise of warmth, conversation, and time spent together. But Betty Crocker's next forgotten supper proved that even the simplest pantry staples could create something unexpectedly delicious, turning canned tuna and ordinary rice into a one-skillet meal that busy American families requested again and again. 20 Tuna and rice skillet. How did two ordinary pantry staples become one of Betty Crocker's smartest weeknight suppers? At a time when every dollar mattered and busy homemakers needed dependable meals, this simple one-skillet recipe proved that comfort food did not have to be complicated. During the 1950s, tuna and rice skillet became a trusted favorite in homes across America. With little more than canned tuna, long-grain rice, onions, and a creamy mushroom sauce, families could create a hearty supper using ingredients they almost always had on hand. Everything cooked together in a single skillet, allowing the rice to slowly absorb the rich flavors while keeping preparation simple and cleanup even easier. The process was wonderfully straightforward. Chopped onions were gently cooked in butter until soft and fragrant before uncooked rice was stirred into the pan. Warm broth and a creamy sauce were added, giving the rice plenty of time to become tender while soaking up every bit of savory flavor. Just before serving, flaky tuna was folded into the skillet, keeping the pieces delicate instead of overcooked. A sprinkle of fresh parsley completed the dish, adding a welcome touch of color to its creamy finish. Families appreciated this recipe because it delivered a satisfying meal without requiring expensive ingredients or hours in the kitchen. It was perfect for busy school nights, especially when children arrived home hungry and parents needed supper on the table quickly. Despite its simplicity, the combination of creamy rice and tender tuna created a meal that felt wholesome, filling, and comforting. Today, quick dinners often come from a freezer or a drive-through window, but tuna and rice skillet reminds us that some of the best family meals were made from the simplest pantry staples with a little patience and care. But Betty Crocker had another forgotten casserole waiting to surprise American families, one that layered seasoned ground beef, tender macaroni, and bubbling cheese into a supper that became the highlight of countless church potlucks and neighborhood gatherings. 19. Beef and macaroni bake. What made a pan of ground beef, macaroni, and melted cheese become one of Betty Crocker's most dependable family suppers? Long before boxed pasta dinners filled grocery store shelves, this homemade casserole showed that a handful of everyday ingredients could create a meal everyone looked forward to. During the 1950s, beef and macaroni bake earned a permanent place in Betty Crocker cookbooks because it was hearty, affordable, and easy to prepare. Ground beef was browned with onions until perfectly savory, then seasoned with herbs and combined with a rich tomato sauce that slowly simmered to develop deep, comforting flavor. Cooked elbow macaroni was folded into the mixture before everything was layered in a buttered baking dish and generously topped with sharp cheddar cheese. As the casserole baked, the cheese melted into a bubbling golden blanket while the tomato sauce soaked into every piece of pasta. The edges turned lightly crisp, adding just enough texture to contrast with the creamy center. By the time it reached the dinner table, every serving offered tender beef, perfectly cooked macaroni, and rich melted cheese in every bite. For busy American families, this casserole solved two problems at once. It stretched a modest amount of ground beef into a filling meal for the entire household, and it could easily be prepared ahead of time before baking just as everyone arrived home. It quickly became a favorite for school nights, church suppers, and neighborhood potlucks because it traveled well and tasted just as delicious the next day. Although countless baked pasta dishes exist today, many trace their popularity back to simple recipes like this one. Beef and macaroni bake reminds us that some of America's greatest comfort foods were never complicated. They were built on practical ingredients, careful cooking, and the joy of sharing a warm homemade supper with family. But Betty Crocker's next forgotten favorite proved that even yesterday's leftover chicken could be transformed into a crispy, golden supper elegant enough to impress guests at the dinner table. 18. Chicken croquettes. How did yesterday's roast chicken become one of Betty Crocker's most elegant homemade suppers? At a time when wasting food was simply not an option, resourceful American homemakers discovered that leftovers could be transformed into a meal that looked worthy of a special occasion. Throughout the 1950s, chicken croquettes became a familiar favorite in Betty Crocker cookbooks. Finely chopped cooked chicken was blended with a rich, creamy white sauce, seasoned with parsley, black pepper, and a subtle pinch of nutmeg. Once chilled, the mixture was shaped into neat oval rolls, coated in beaten egg and fine breadcrumbs, then fried until perfectly crisp and golden brown. The contrast in texture made this supper unforgettable. The outside developed a delicate, crunchy crust, while the inside remained creamy, tender, and packed with savory chicken flavor. Served with buttery mashed potatoes, green beans, or a spoonful of creamy gravy, every bite delivered the kind of comfort that made families ask for the recipe. One reason this dish became so popular was its remarkable versatility. It gave leftover chicken a completely new identity, making it hard to believe it had begun as the previous day's roast. Many homemakers even prepared the croquettes ahead of time, storing them in the refrigerator until they were ready to fry just before supper, making them a practical choice for busy evenings or unexpected guests. Today, chicken croquettes have almost disappeared from everyday American kitchens, yet they remain a perfect example of the creativity that defined mid-century home cooking. Betty Crocker encouraged families to waste nothing, proving that careful preparation and a little imagination could turn ordinary leftovers into something both beautiful and delicious. But if you thought leftover chicken could not become anything more impressive than this, the next forgotten Betty Crocker supper transformed a humble pantry staple into a rich, slow-baked casserole that became a favorite at church dinners and family gatherings across America. 17. Pork and bean casserole. How did a few cans of baked beans become one of Betty Crocker's most comforting family suppers? At a time when stretching the grocery budget was part of everyday life, this hearty casserole proved that simple pantry staples could become a meal worthy of the Sunday dinner table. During the 1950s, pork and bean casserole earned a place in countless Betty Crocker cookbooks because it was inexpensive, filling, and incredibly satisfying. Sweet baked beans formed the heart of the dish, but Betty Crocker's recipe elevated them with thick slices of smoky bacon, chopped onions, and a rich blend of brown sugar, mustard, and tomato sauce. As everything baked together, the flavors slowly blended into a rich, savory casserole that tasted far more elaborate than its humble ingredients suggested. The slow baking was what made this supper unforgettable. The bacon became perfectly crisp around the edges while its smoky flavors soaked deep into the beans. The sweet glaze caramelized across the top, creating a rich, glossy finish that invited everyone to scoop out just one more serving. Every bite balanced sweetness, smokiness, and hearty comfort in a way that made this casserole a favorite at family gatherings. Busy homemakers appreciated that most of the ingredients came straight from the pantry, making it an ideal recipe for evenings when fresh groceries were running low. It also traveled well, which helped it become a familiar sight at church socials, neighborhood potlucks, and community dinners where comforting homemade food always brought people together. Today, baked beans are usually served as a side dish, but this forgotten Betty Crocker supper reminds us that they once proudly took center stage. With little more than a baking dish and a handful of everyday ingredients, families created a meal that was warm, satisfying, and memorable. But Betty Crocker's next forgotten favorite took an entirely different direction, combining tender shrimp, creamy cheese sauce, and buttery noodles into a surprisingly elegant casserole that brought a touch of seafood luxury to ordinary American kitchens. 16. Shrimp and noodle bake. How did frozen shrimp become the secret ingredient behind one of Betty Crocker's most elegant family suppers? In an era when seafood was often reserved for special occasions, this creamy casserole brought a touch of restaurant-style dining into ordinary American kitchens without requiring complicated techniques. During the late 1950s, shrimp and noodle bake appeared in Betty Crocker cookbooks as a simple yet impressive meal for both family dinners and weekend entertaining. Tender egg noodles were gently combined with plump shrimp, sliced mushrooms, and a smooth cheese sauce made with butter, milk, and sharp cheddar. A creamy mushroom sauce tied everything together before the mixture was transferred to a buttered casserole dish and topped with golden breadcrumbs seasoned with a light sprinkle of paprika. As the casserole baked, the cheese melted into a rich, velvety sauce while the buttery topping turned crisp and beautifully golden. The shrimp stayed tender, the noodles absorbed every bit of creamy flavor, and each serving offered the perfect combination of delicate seafood, comforting pasta, and crunchy topping. It looked elegant enough for guests but remained simple enough for an ordinary weeknight meal. Families appreciated this recipe because it allowed them to serve seafood without spending hours in the kitchen. Frozen shrimp had become easier to find in grocery stores, giving homemakers an affordable way to prepare a supper that felt both modern and sophisticated. It soon became a popular choice for Friday dinners, holiday gatherings, and neighborhood potlucks where casseroles were always welcome. Today, creamy seafood bakes are rarely found in home kitchens, yet this forgotten Betty Crocker favorite reminds us that some of the most memorable meals were created with everyday ingredients and a little imagination. It was proof that elegance did not always require expensive restaurants. Sometimes it came straight from a family oven. But the next forgotten Betty Crocker supper returned to an old American favorite, layering smoky ham, tender potatoes, and rich cheese into a comforting casserole that generations looked forward to every Sunday. 15. Ham and scalloped potatoes. What made layers of ham and potatoes one of Betty Crocker's most comforting Sunday suppers? At a time when families gathered faithfully around the dinner table every weekend, this rich, bubbling casserole became a tradition that many children remembered long after they had grown up. Throughout the 1950s, ham and scalloped potatoes earned its place in Betty Crocker cookbooks as the perfect way to transform leftover baked ham into a hearty family meal. Thin slices of potatoes were carefully layered with diced ham before being covered in a creamy homemade cheese sauce made from butter, flour, milk, and sharp cheddar. Every layer received a light seasoning of black pepper and paprika, ensuring that each bite was full of comforting flavor. The magic happened slowly in the oven. As the casserole baked, the potatoes softened until they were melt-in-your-mouth tender, soaking up the smoky richness of the ham and the creamy cheese sauce. The top developed a beautifully golden crust while the edges turned slightly crisp, creating the perfect contrast to the velvety layers beneath. The aroma alone was enough to bring everyone into the kitchen before supper was even served. For busy homemakers, this recipe was practical as well as delicious. It stretched leftover holiday ham into another complete meal while using inexpensive pantry staples that were always close at hand. Whether served after Easter, Christmas, or an ordinary Sunday roast, it became a dependable favorite that wasted nothing and satisfied everyone at the table. Although scalloped potatoes still appear on holiday menus today, this classic Betty Crocker version reminds us of a time when leftovers were transformed with care rather than reheated out of convenience. It was a simple supper that brought warmth, conversation, and generations together around one baking dish. But Betty Crocker's next forgotten masterpiece gave Thanksgiving leftovers an entirely new life, turning roasted turkey and pasta into a creamy casserole that many families secretly loved even more than the holiday feast itself. 14. Turkey tetrazzini. How did Thanksgiving leftovers become one of Betty Crocker's most celebrated family suppers? Instead of serving slices of turkey for days after the holiday, resourceful home cooks discovered a creamy pasta casserole that many families eagerly anticipated just as much as the Thanksgiving feast itself. During the 1950s, turkey tetrazzini became a standout recipe in Betty Crocker cookbooks because it transformed leftover roasted turkey into an elegant yet practical meal. Tender pieces of turkey were folded together with cooked spaghetti, sliced mushrooms, and a rich cream sauce made from butter, flour, milk, and flavorful turkey broth. A generous handful of grated Parmesan cheese added a savory richness, while a light topping of buttered breadcrumbs baked into a crisp, golden crust. As the casserole slowly baked, the creamy sauce coated every strand of spaghetti while the turkey remained tender and juicy. The bubbling cheese created irresistible golden edges, and the toasted breadcrumbs added just the right amount of crunch. Every forkful offered a comforting blend of creamy pasta, delicate turkey, and earthy mushrooms that felt both familiar and wonderfully satisfying. Families especially loved this recipe because it gave holiday leftovers a completely new identity. Rather than feeling like another reheated meal, turkey tetrazzini became a supper people genuinely looked forward to. It was perfect for feeding visiting relatives, sending home with guests, or enjoying during the quiet days after the holiday celebrations had ended. Although countless pasta casseroles fill today's cookbooks, few capture the same nostalgic charm as this Betty Crocker classic. It reflected an era when thoughtful home cooking meant finding creative ways to make every ingredient count while keeping loved ones gathered around the table. But Betty Crocker's next forgotten supper proved that even an old-fashioned beef stew could be reinvented. With a rich, slow-cooked filling hidden beneath a blanket of fluffy biscuits, it became one of the most comforting one-dish meals ever to come from an American family kitchen. Third, beef stew casserole. How did an old-fashioned pot of beef stew become one of Betty Crocker's most comforting oven-baked suppers? Long before slow cookers became a kitchen staple, this hearty casserole proved that a single baking dish could deliver a meal rich enough to warm an entire family after a long day. During the 1950s, beef stew casserole earned a special place in Betty Crocker cookbooks because it combined everything families loved about traditional beef stew with the convenience of an all-in-one supper. Tender chunks of beef were slowly cooked with carrots, potatoes, celery, and onions until they became wonderfully soft. A rich brown gravy, seasoned with herbs and black pepper, brought every ingredient together into a filling that was both hearty and deeply flavorful. But what truly set this dish apart was its golden biscuit topping. Instead of serving bread on the side, soft spoonfuls of biscuit dough were dropped directly over the bubbling stew before it went into the oven. As the casserole baked, the biscuits rose into fluffy, golden peaks while absorbing just enough of the savory gravy underneath to become incredibly tender. The result was the perfect combination of crisp tops, soft centers, and rich beef stew in every spoonful. Families loved this recipe because it provided everything they needed in one dish. Meat, vegetables, gravy, and warm biscuits came together in a supper that satisfied hungry children and hard-working parents alike. It was especially welcome during the colder months, when a hot homemade meal brought comfort after long days at school, work, or out in the winter weather. Although today's kitchens offer countless shortcuts, few meals capture the same feeling of homemade comfort as this forgotten Betty Crocker classic. It reminds us that the simplest ingredients, cooked with patience and care, often created the most unforgettable family dinners. But Betty Crocker's next forgotten supper proved that just one skillet, a few pieces of chicken, and a handful of rice could create one of the easiest and most beloved weeknight meals of the entire decade. 12. Chicken and rice skillet. How did one skillet filled with chicken and rice become one of Betty Crocker's most dependable family suppers? In the years after World War II, when life became busier but family dinners still mattered, this simple recipe proved that a handful of everyday ingredients could create a meal everyone eagerly anticipated. Throughout the late 1950s, chicken and rice skillet became a trusted favorite in Betty Crocker cookbooks because it delivered a complete supper without filling the kitchen with dirty pots and pans. Bone-in chicken pieces were seasoned with salt, pepper, and paprika, then browned until the skin turned beautifully golden. After the chicken was set aside, onions and celery were gently cooked in the same skillet, allowing them to absorb every bit of the flavorful drippings. Long-grain rice was stirred into the pan before warm chicken broth was poured over everything. The browned chicken returned to the skillet, and the dish was covered to cook slowly as the rice soaked up every drop of the rich broth. By the time supper was ready, the chicken had become wonderfully tender while the rice was fluffy, buttery, and packed with savory flavor. Every serving delivered a perfect balance of juicy chicken and perfectly seasoned rice. Families loved this recipe because it required very little attention once the lid was on. While supper gently simmered, parents could help with homework, finish household chores, or simply enjoy a quiet moment before everyone gathered around the table. It was wholesome, economical, and dependable, exactly the kind of recipe that made Betty Crocker a household name. Although countless one-pan meals exist today, few have earned the lasting affection of this forgotten classic. It reminds us that the most memorable family dinners were often the simplest ones, prepared with care and shared without hurry. But the next forgotten Betty Crocker supper took ordinary ground beef and mashed potatoes and transformed them into a baked masterpiece that became one of America's most beloved comfort foods. 11. Shepherd's Pie Deluxe. How did a humble meat and potatoes supper become one of Betty Crocker's most impressive comfort food classics? Long before gourmet restaurants gave it a modern makeover, this hearty casserole was bringing American families together with layers of simple ingredients that tasted far more special than they looked. During the 1950s, Shepherd's Pie Deluxe became a favorite in Betty Crocker cookbooks because it transformed everyday pantry staples into a complete family meal. Ground beef was browned with onions until richly flavored, then blended with carrots, peas, corn, and a savory gravy seasoned with Worcestershire sauce and herbs. The mixture was spread into a deep baking dish before being covered with a generous layer of creamy mashed potatoes whipped with butter and milk until perfectly smooth. Before the casserole went into the oven, home cooks used the back of a fork to create decorative ridges across the mashed potatoes. As it baked, those ridges turned beautifully golden while the buttery potatoes developed a light, crisp crust. Beneath that golden topping, the rich beef filling bubbled gently, allowing every flavor to come together into one comforting bite. Families loved this recipe because it delivered everything they wanted in a single dish. It was hearty enough for growing children, filling enough for hard-working parents, and practical enough to prepare ahead of time before a busy evening. Even better, leftovers often tasted richer the following day as the flavors continued to blend together. Although shepherd's pie remains popular today, many modern versions have lost the simple homemade charm that made Betty Crocker's recipe so memorable. This was more than just a casserole. It was the kind of supper that filled the kitchen with warmth, encouraged everyone to gather around the table, and turned an ordinary evening into a family tradition. But Betty Crocker's next forgotten creation elevated chicken and broccoli into an elegant casserole that became a favorite at ladies' luncheons and special gatherings across America. 10. Chicken divan. How did a simple combination of chicken and broccoli become one of Betty Crocker's most elegant supper recipes? During the late 1950s, when families wanted meals that felt a little more refined without spending hours in the kitchen, chicken divan offered the perfect balance of comfort and sophistication. Originally inspired by a famous New York restaurant, Betty Crocker adapted chicken divan into a practical recipe that any home cook could prepare. Tender pieces of cooked chicken were arranged over lightly steamed broccoli before being covered with a rich, creamy sauce made from butter, milk, chicken broth, and shredded Swiss cheese. A sprinkle of grated Parmesan and buttery breadcrumbs finished the top, creating a golden crust as the casserole baked. The transformation happened inside the oven. The creamy sauce slowly melted into every piece of chicken and broccoli while the cheese developed a beautifully brown topping that added just the right amount of crunch. The broccoli stayed tender without becoming mushy, giving each bite a fresh flavor that perfectly balanced the richness of the sauce. It looked elegant enough for guests but remained comforting enough for an ordinary family supper. Chicken divan quickly became a favorite for Sunday dinners, holiday luncheons, and neighborhood gatherings because it could be prepared ahead of time and baked just before serving. Homemakers appreciated how easily it fed a crowd, while guests often assumed it required far more effort than it actually did. It became one of those dependable recipes that families proudly passed from one generation to the next. Although it rarely appears on modern dinner tables, chicken divan reminds us of an era when homemade casseroles could feel every bit as elegant as restaurant meals. Betty Crocker proved that thoughtful preparation and simple ingredients could turn an everyday supper into something truly memorable. But the next forgotten Betty Crocker creation may be the most surprising yet, transforming an ordinary can of tuna into a beautifully molded centerpiece that once amazed dinner guests across America. 9. Tuna ring mold. How did an ordinary can of tuna become the centerpiece of one of Betty Crocker's most unforgettable dinner party creations? In the 1950s, presentation was just as important as flavor, and this eye-catching molded salad turned a simple pantry staple into something guests could not stop talking about. During the height of America's fascination with elegant entertaining, Betty Crocker introduced the tuna ring mold as a stylish dish for luncheons, bridge clubs, and warm-weather suppers. Flaked tuna was blended with finely chopped celery, crisp onions, hard-boiled eggs, and a creamy mayonnaise dressing. The mixture was carefully packed into a decorative ring mold lined with lemon-flavored gelatin, then chilled until perfectly firm. Just before serving, the mold was turned onto a platter and the center was filled with crisp lettuce, fresh vegetables, or a colorful salad. The finished presentation was unlike anything found on today's dinner tables. The glossy molded ring caught the light beautifully, while every slice revealed delicate layers of tuna, vegetables, and creamy filling. Paired with buttered rolls or fresh fruit, it offered a light yet satisfying meal that felt modern and sophisticated for its time. This recipe became especially popular because it could be prepared hours in advance, leaving homemakers free to welcome guests instead of rushing around the kitchen. It was practical, attractive, and reflected an era when careful presentation was considered part of gracious hospitality. Even simple ingredients were expected to look elegant when placed on the table. Today, molded salads have nearly vanished from American home cooking, but they remain a fascinating reminder of mid-century entertaining. Betty Crocker encouraged families to have fun with presentation, proving that creativity could make even the most familiar ingredients feel extraordinary. But if this chilled supper seemed elegant, the next forgotten Betty Crocker recipe brought the rich flavors of the French countryside into American kitchens, introducing home cooks to a slow-cooked beef dish that tasted like a celebration in every bite. 8. Beef Burgundy. How did a rustic French beef stew become one of Betty Crocker's most sophisticated suppers? During the 1950s, American home cooks were eager to bring international flavors into their kitchens, and this elegant recipe made classic French cooking feel surprisingly achievable. Betty Crocker's version of beef burgundy introduced families to the rich, slow-cooked flavors of beef gently braised with onions, mushrooms, and carrots in a savory broth enriched with burgundy wine. Thick cubes of beef were first browned until they developed a deep caramelized crust, locking in their flavor before they slowly simmered for hours. As the meat became fork-tender, every vegetable absorbed the rich sauce, creating a supper that tasted as though it had been prepared by a skilled chef. The aroma alone made the long wait worthwhile. The combination of herbs, onions, mushrooms, and slowly braised beef filled the kitchen with an unmistakable warmth that promised something special was waiting at the dinner table. Served over buttered egg noodles, fluffy rice, or creamy mashed potatoes, every bite delivered tender beef coated in a silky, deeply flavorful sauce that lingered long after the meal was finished. Although the recipe sounded elegant, Betty Crocker carefully adapted it for everyday American kitchens. Clear instructions and familiar ingredients gave homemakers the confidence to prepare a dish that once seemed reserved for fine restaurants. It quickly became a favorite for Sunday dinners, holiday celebrations, and special family occasions when something memorable was worth the extra time. Today, beef burgundy is often associated with upscale dining, but its Betty Crocker version reminds us that extraordinary meals were once created in ordinary kitchens with patience, simple techniques, and quality ingredients. It proved that home cooking could be every bit as impressive as dining out. But Betty Crocker's next forgotten supper took luxury to an entirely new level, transforming tender lobster into a creamy masterpiece that became one of the most glamorous dishes ever to appear in an American cookbook. 7. Lobster Newburg. How did one of America's most luxurious seafood dishes find its way into Betty Crocker cookbooks? During the 1950s, serving lobster Newburg at home was considered the ultimate sign of elegant entertaining, proving that a special occasion deserved a truly unforgettable supper. Originally made famous in some of New York's finest restaurants, lobster Newburg seemed far beyond the reach of the average home cook. Betty Crocker changed that by adapting the classic recipe into clear, step-by-step instructions that gave families the confidence to prepare this celebrated dish in their own kitchens. Tender pieces of lobster were gently folded into a velvety sauce made with butter, cream, egg yolks, and a splash of sherry, creating a rich combination of flavors that felt both refined and comforting. The secret to its remarkable texture was careful cooking. The sauce remained silky and smooth while the lobster stayed tender and delicate, allowing its naturally sweet flavor to shine. Served over buttered toast points, fluffy rice, or crisp puff pastry shells, every bite delivered a richness that instantly made an ordinary dinner feel like a grand celebration. Although lobster was considered a luxury ingredient, many families reserved this recipe for anniversaries, Christmas dinners, milestone birthdays, or other memorable occasions. It became the centerpiece of the meal, often accompanied by candlelight, polished silverware, and the feeling that something truly special was being shared around the table. Betty Crocker showed that elegant dining was not limited to expensive restaurants. It could happen right at home with patience, quality ingredients, and careful preparation. Today, lobster Newburg is rarely seen outside classic cookbooks, but it remains a beautiful reminder of an era when home cooks proudly challenged themselves with sophisticated recipes. It reflected the belief that preparing an extraordinary meal was one of the greatest ways to celebrate the people gathered around the table. But the next forgotten Betty Crocker supper traveled even farther, introducing American families to a rich Hungarian-inspired classic whose deep paprika flavor made every bite unforgettable. 6. Veal paprikash. How did a traditional Hungarian family recipe become one of Betty Crocker's most sophisticated supper ideas? During the 1950s, American kitchens began embracing flavors from around the world, and this rich, paprika-seasoned dish introduced countless families to a comforting meal they had never tasted before. Betty Crocker's veal paprikash took inspiration from the beloved Hungarian classic while making it practical for everyday home cooks. Thin slices of tender veal were lightly coated in flour, then browned in butter before being slowly simmered with onions, sweet paprika, and a flavorful broth. As the meat became perfectly tender, a generous spoonful of sour cream was stirred into the sauce, creating the smooth, velvety finish that made this dish so memorable. The aroma filling the kitchen was unlike anything most American families had experienced before. The sweet fragrance of paprika blended with buttery onions and the rich cooking juices, creating a warm, inviting scent that promised an unforgettable supper. Served over wide buttered egg noodles, every bite delivered tender veal wrapped in a creamy sauce that balanced richness with a gentle touch of spice. For many homemakers, this recipe offered an exciting way to bring international cooking to the family table without requiring unfamiliar techniques or expensive equipment. Betty Crocker's carefully tested instructions gave cooks the confidence to prepare a dish that looked elegant enough for company while remaining comforting enough for a quiet family dinner. It quickly became a favorite for Sunday meals and special occasions when something a little different was desired. Although veal paprikash rarely appears on modern dinner tables, it remains a wonderful reminder of an era when home cooks eagerly explored new flavors while preserving the warmth of homemade meals. Betty Crocker proved that great cooking could connect families not only to one another but also to traditions from around the world. But the next forgotten Betty Crocker supper may be the most elegant surprise yet, transforming tender duck and a bright citrus sauce into a restaurant-worthy meal that once dazzled dinner guests across America. 5. Duck à l'orange. How did a classic French restaurant specialty become one of Betty Crocker's most ambitious supper recipes? During the late 1950s, when American home cooks were eager to expand their culinary skills, this elegant duck dish proved that fine dining could be recreated in an ordinary family kitchen. Betty Crocker's adaptation of duck à l'orange carefully simplified a celebrated French classic without sacrificing its signature flavors. Duck pieces were slowly roasted until the skin became beautifully crisp and golden, while the meat stayed tender and juicy beneath the surface. Meanwhile, a bright citrus sauce was prepared using fresh orange juice, grated orange zest, butter, chicken stock, and a touch of sugar, creating the perfect balance of sweetness and savory richness that made this dish famous around the world. As the duck finished roasting, the fragrant orange sauce was spooned over each piece, allowing the glossy glaze to coat every bite. The crisp skin, tender meat, and vibrant citrus flavors created a combination that felt both refreshing and luxurious. Served with wild rice, buttered vegetables, or roasted potatoes, it transformed an ordinary dinner into an unforgettable occasion. Although this recipe required a little more patience than Betty Crocker's everyday casseroles, families proudly prepared it for holiday celebrations, anniversary dinners, and other milestones worth remembering. It represented a growing confidence among American homemakers, who were discovering that international cuisine did not have to remain inside expensive restaurants. With Betty Crocker's clear instructions, even an elegant French classic became surprisingly approachable. Today, duck à l'orange is rarely prepared in home kitchens, yet it remains a reminder of a time when cooking was considered both a skill and a labor of love. It encouraged families to slow down, celebrate life's special moments, and create lasting memories around a carefully prepared meal. But the next forgotten Betty Crocker supper raised the bar even higher, wrapping tender beef in flaky pastry to create one of the most impressive dishes ever served from a home oven. 4. Individual beef Wellington. How did one of the world's most celebrated beef dishes become a recipe that ambitious American home cooks proudly served from their own ovens? During the late 1950s, Betty Crocker introduced a simplified version of beef Wellington that transformed an intimidating restaurant classic into a memorable supper for life's biggest celebrations. Unlike everyday family meals, individual beef Wellington was reserved for occasions that called for something extraordinary. Thick beef tenderloin medallions were first seared until beautifully browned, locking in their natural juices. Each piece was then topped with a savory mushroom duxelle made from finely chopped mushrooms, onions, butter, and herbs before being carefully wrapped in buttery puff pastry. A light coating of beaten egg gave the pastry its signature golden finish as it baked. The moment the pastries emerged from the oven, they looked almost too beautiful to cut. The crisp, flaky layers surrounded perfectly tender beef, while the rich mushroom filling added deep, earthy flavor to every bite. Served alongside roasted vegetables and buttery potatoes, it created a supper that felt worthy of the finest dining rooms without ever leaving home. Although the recipe required patience and careful timing, many homemakers embraced the challenge. Preparing beef Wellington became a way to celebrate anniversaries, Christmas dinners, birthdays, and other once-in-a-lifetime occasions. Betty Crocker's detailed instructions gave ordinary cooks the confidence to master a dish that had once seemed reserved for professional chefs. Today, beef Wellington is still admired for its elegance, but few families prepare it from scratch the way they once did. This forgotten Betty Crocker classic reminds us that home cooking was about more than feeding a family. It was about creating unforgettable moments, learning new skills, and showing love through a carefully prepared meal that everyone would remember long after the plates were cleared. But if you think wrapping beef in golden pastry was impressive, the next forgotten Betty Crocker supper brought another French masterpiece into American kitchens, proving that a humble chicken could become the star of an unforgettable dinner. 3. Coq au vin. How did an old French farmhouse recipe become one of Betty Crocker's most ambitious suppers? During the 1950s, American families became fascinated with European cooking, and this slow-simmered chicken dish gave home cooks the chance to prepare a meal that felt both elegant and deeply comforting. Betty Crocker's version of coq au vin took the mystery out of the famous French classic without losing its rich, traditional character. Chicken pieces were first browned until their skin turned beautifully golden, then gently simmered with onions, mushrooms, carrots, and fragrant herbs in a flavorful broth enriched with red wine. As the hours passed, the chicken became incredibly tender while the vegetables soaked up every drop of the savory sauce. The transformation was remarkable. What began as a simple chicken dinner slowly developed into a rich, aromatic meal filled with layers of flavor. The wine mellowed during cooking, leaving behind a deep, velvety sauce that coated every bite. Served over buttered egg noodles, creamy mashed potatoes, or thick slices of crusty bread, it turned an ordinary evening into something that felt worthy of a special celebration. Although it sounded like a recipe reserved for professional chefs, Betty Crocker carefully adapted it for everyday American kitchens. Clear instructions encouraged homemakers to experiment with international cuisine while using familiar cooking techniques they already trusted. It soon became a favorite for holiday dinners, dinner parties and weekends when families had time to enjoy a leisurely meal together. Today, coq au vin is still respected as one of France's great comfort foods, yet few people realize it once appeared in vintage Betty Crocker cookbooks alongside everyday American favorites. It reminds us of an era when home cooking was about curiosity, patience, and the joy of discovering new flavors around the family table. But if this French masterpiece impressed you, the next forgotten Betty Crocker supper became the ultimate romantic dinner, bringing one of the most luxurious steakhouse classics into American homes for unforgettable celebrations. 2. Chateaubriand for two. How did one of the most luxurious steakhouse dinners become a recipe that couples could proudly prepare at home? During the late 1950s, Betty Crocker proved that an unforgettable celebration did not require an expensive restaurant. With the right ingredients and careful technique, an ordinary dining room could feel just as elegant. Chateaubriand for two quickly became one of Betty Crocker's most admired special occasion recipes. A thick center-cut beef tenderloin was generously seasoned before being carefully seared to lock in its natural juices. It was then roasted until the outside developed a rich, flavorful crust while the center remained tender, juicy, and beautifully pink. Served with a silky mushroom sauce or a classic béarnaise sauce, every slice felt like the centerpiece of a truly memorable meal. The beauty of this supper was its simplicity. There were no complicated casseroles or lengthy ingredient lists. Instead, the focus remained on perfectly cooked beef, fresh vegetables, and careful preparation. Roasted asparagus, buttered potatoes, or glazed carrots completed the plate, creating an elegant dinner that rivaled the finest steakhouses of the era. For many couples, this recipe became a cherished tradition. It appeared on anniversary tables, birthday celebrations, and quiet evenings when a homemade meal meant far more than a reservation. Betty Crocker encouraged families to believe that special moments could be created in their own kitchens, where every detail reflected care rather than convenience. Today, Chateaubriand is still considered a symbol of fine dining, yet few home cooks attempt the classic recipe that once inspired so much confidence. It reminds us that the greatest meals were never measured by price alone. They were remembered because they celebrated the people gathered around the table and the memories created with every shared bite. But before we reveal Betty Crocker's most extraordinary forgotten supper, get ready for a dish that represented the absolute height of mid-century American entertaining, a masterpiece that proved home cooks could rival even the world's finest restaurants. 1. Beef tenderloin rossini. What was the most luxurious supper Betty Crocker ever encouraged American home cooks to prepare? At a time when elegant entertaining was considered an art, beef tenderloin rossini stood at the very top of the list. It was the kind of meal reserved for life's biggest celebrations, proving that an ordinary kitchen could produce something truly extraordinary. Inspired by the famous French creation known as Tournedos rossini, Betty Crocker's version brought refined European cooking within reach of ambitious home cooks. Thick beef tenderloin medallions were carefully seasoned, then seared in butter until a rich, caramelized crust formed on the outside while the center remained wonderfully tender. The steaks were served with a luxurious mushroom and Madeira wine sauce that slowly reduced into a silky glaze, coating every bite with deep, savory flavor. For families seeking an especially elegant presentation, the beef was often paired with crisp toast rounds and beautifully arranged vegetables that completed the meal. This recipe represented far more than an impressive dinner. It reflected an era when preparing a special meal was a meaningful expression of love, hospitality, and pride. Homemakers spent hours planning every detail, from polished silverware to freshly baked rolls, because gathering around the table was an occasion worth celebrating. Beef tenderloin rossini became the centerpiece of anniversaries, holiday dinners, and milestone family events that would be remembered for years. Today, this remarkable recipe has almost vanished from American kitchens, replaced by quicker meals and modern conveniences. Yet it remains a lasting reminder of Betty Crocker's greatest lesson. Exceptional food was never just about expensive ingredients. It was about patience, care, and bringing people together through the simple joy of a homemade meal. Which of these forgotten Betty Crocker suppers would you bring back to your own dinner table? Let us know in the comments below, and if these vintage recipes brought back a few memories, Be sure to subscribe for more forgotten American foods, timeless family favorites, and nostalgic recipes that deserve to be remembered once again. Before you go, take a moment to think about all the incredible meals we've uncovered today. These were not just recipes from old Betty Crocker cookbooks. They were the suppers that welcomed fathers home after long workdays, gathered children around the dinner table, and turned ordinary evenings into lasting family memories. While many of these dishes have quietly disappeared from modern kitchens, they remain a beautiful reminder that the simplest meals often carried the greatest meaning. Now we would love to hear from you. Which of these forgotten Betty Crocker suppers brought back the strongest memories? Or which one would you be excited to cook again? Share your favorite in the comments below because your stories are part of keeping these classic recipes alive. If you enjoyed this journey through America's forgotten kitchens, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to America's Lost Recipes, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another trip back in time. Every week, we uncover more vintage recipes, forgotten family favorites, and the delicious stories behind the meals that shaped generations. Until next time, keep those treasured cookbooks close, keep family traditions alive, and remember that sometimes the best recipes are the ones history almost forgot.